those China's about to collapse predictions, they've been running on a loop for like decades.
Yeah, definitely.
You're not alone. And it turns out there might be a reason for that.
Yeah.
You requested a deep dive into the 100-Year Marathon by Michael PILLSBURY. And let me tell you, getting through this book, well, it is a marathon in itself.
Right.
But it's packed with insights coming from PILLSBURY's decades as a China expert within the U.S. government.
Yeah, what's so interesting is that PILLSBURY, he went into this advocating for engagement with China.
Really?
But through classified information and his interactions with Chinese officials.
Okay.
He started seeing a different picture emerge, like a strategy playing out over generations.
Okay, so let's unpack this hidden strategy. PILLSBURY kicks off chapter 1, the China Dream.
Yeah.
With a quote that really sets the stage. It's from Confucius. It says, "There cannot be two suns in the sky, nor two emperors on the earth." This isn't just like some ancient proverb. PILLSBURY argues that this mentality is deeply ingrained in China's approach to global power.
And that brings us to Xi Jinping. His rise to power marked a clear embrace of this road to renewal, a concept that, taps into China's long history.
Okay.
What PILLSBURY reveals is that China has been operating on a deliberate long-term plan to surpass the U.S. and reclaim what they see as their rightful place as the dominant global power.
So it's not just about economic growth or military might. It's about a mindset.
Some mindset, yeah.
But how does this play out in practical terms? This is where the 100-Year Marathon concept comes in.
Right. So PILLSBURY argues that China is on a race to 2049, the 100th anniversary of the Communist Revolution, with the U.S. as the competitor, though. He uses the term unwitting competitor, which is key.
Okay.
It suggests that while the U.S. might see this as, a potential partnership, China views it as a zero-sum game. There can only be one winner. And to really drive home this point, PILLSBURY highlights the influence of Darwinian thought on Chinese strategy. But here's the twist. It's less about natural selection and more about the elimination of rivals.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. PILLSBURY points to Yanfu's mistranslation of Darwin, which introduced a more cutthroat interpretation of survival of the fittest into Chinese intellectual circles.
Interesting.
The weaker are devoured.
Right.
And to further their advantage, the Chinese government, they actively cultivate a narrative of historical victimhood, leveraging Western guilt to gain concessions and aid along the way.
So they're playing the long game using every tool at their disposal.
Exactly.
And this brings us to chapter 2, Warring States. This isn't just a history lesson, is it?
Not at all. PILLSBURY argues that the Warring States period, which lasted from 475 to 221 BC, is deeply embedded in the Chinese Communist Party's strategic thinking. In fact, he reveals that they secretly use Warring States proverbs to describe their strategic goals.
Okay, this is where it gets a little unnerving.
Right.
One example PILLSBURY cites is the saying, "Dao Guang Yang Hui." This was initially leaked and mistranslated as "bide your time, build your capabilities."
Yeah.
Which on the surface sounds pretty benign.
Right.
But the real meaning is far more aggressive. To overturn the hegemon and exact revenge once the rising power has the strength to do so.
And we've seen evidence of this bide your time strategy throughout history. PILLSBURY points out that the U.S. has consistently underestimated the influence of China's hawks or the hardliners within the government who are driving this marathon strategy.
It's like they've been reading from a different playbook entirely, one that we're only just starting to understand.
Right.
And that raises a question for me, and maybe for you listening. If China is so intent on becoming the dominant power, why doesn't their military reflect that ambition?
Right.
Why not flex more muscle? That's where chapter 3, Asking the Way to the Cauldrons, comes in.
So PILLSBURY uses a fascinating story from the Warring States period to answer that question.
Okay.
It's about two rulers, one weaker and one stronger.
Okay.
Each with a cauldron symbolizing their power.
Okay.
The weaker ruler, he asks the stronger ruler, how much his cauldron weighs, essentially challenging him. This was, of course, a foolish move. The stronger ruler, he easily crushes the weaker one.
So what's the takeaway for China's strategy?
It's about picking your battles. China, they know that overtly challenging the U.S. before they're truly ready would be disastrous. So they intentionally keep their military spending at a level that doesn't set off alarm bells in the West.
So that seemingly modest military budget is actually a calculated part of their strategy.
Yes, exactly.
But the warring states analogy suggests there will be a point where they break out.
Right.
When they feel the cauldron has finally tipped in their favor.
Yeah.
How do we even know when that will be?
Yeah.
And will we recognize the signs in time?
Right.
It all seems a bit unnerving.
It is, and that leads us to one of the most crucial concepts in the book.
Okay.
Shit.
Okay.
It's the focus of chapter 4, and it's essentially the art of strategic advantage.
Okay.
PILLSBURY argues that China is a master of shit.
Okay.
Using it to exploit subtle opportunities and manipulate situations to their benefit.
So it's more than just brute force.
Exactly.
It's about understanding the currents of power and knowing how to navigate them.
Yes.
Kind of like a chess grandmaster. Always thinking several moves ahead.
Exactly. And PILLSBURY gives us a great historical example of this in action, the Battle of Red Cliff.
Right.
In this battle, a much smaller force used brilliant deception and timing to utterly crush a larger army.
Wow.
And PILLSBURY argues that China has done the same thing to the U.S. time and time again.
And he uses the example of Nixon opening relations with China.
Right.
At the time, it was seen as a major win for the U.S.
Yeah.
But PILLSBURY argues that China skillfully played on U.S.-Soviet tensions to gain concessions and advance their own interests.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It does.
Was the entire U.S.-China rapprochement a calculated part of China's long game rather than a genuine desire for partnership?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
And it's one that PILLSBURY really forces us to grapple with.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to pause for now.
Okay.
We'll be back in just a moment to continue our deep dive into the 100-year marathon.
Sounds good. It certainly challenges the narrative many in the West have held for decades.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the heart of what PILLSBURY is warning about, deception.
Right.
He argues that this is woven into their entire strategy.
So we're not just talking about a rising power looking out for their own interests. We're talking about something more calculated, more Machiavellian.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay.
And PILLSBURY argues that one of the ways they've been able to pull this off is through a strategic use of language itself.
Oh, okay.
Remember that proverb we discussed earlier?
Yeah.
韬光养晦.
Right.
The mistranslation, it wasn't accidental. It was intentional.
So they're using ambiguity to their advantage.
Exactly.
Allowing for plausible deniability.
Yeah.
While they pursue their goals.
Exactly. PILLSBURY, he dives into how the Chinese language, with its inherent ambiguity, can be used to convey multiple meanings.
Okay.
He argues that many Western China experts, they don't grasp these subtleties because they lack fluency.
Right. Yeah. So it's like we're playing a game where we don't even fully understand the rules.
Exactly.
Okay, but let's get into the specifics here.
Yeah.
What are some examples of this deception in action?
Okay.
Because it can't just be ancient proverbs and linguistic tricks.
Right. Well, PILLSBURY argues that this deception plays out in how China presents itself on the world stage. They've become masters of what he calls feigning reform.
Meaning they give the appearance of embracing free markets and globalization while actually strengthening their own state-controlled system.
Precisely. And he highlights how they've used specific events to their advantage.
Okay.
For example, the Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989. While many in the West saw it as a tragic setback for democratic reforms in China, PILLSBURY argues that it actually solidified the hawk's grip on power.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
So an event that many interpreted as a sign of internal conflict was actually a moment that consolidated their strategy.
That's PILLSBURY's argument, and he uses another example, the Belgrade embassy bombing in 1999.
Right.
Now, while the official stance was that this was an accident, Pillsbury presents evidence that suggests it was a deliberate provocation.
Hold on. Are you saying China intentionally bombed the U.S. embassy?
Yeah.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is. And Pillsbury doesn't shy away from controversy.
Okay.
He lays out a case suggesting that China saw this event as an opportunity to exploit to manipulate the situation to their advantage. They deliberately stoked anti-American sentiment both domestically and internationally, and used it to further strengthen their control over information and narrative.
Wow. So what you're saying is that even a tragic event like this could be seen as part of their strategic playbook.
Yes.
It all seems very calculated.
Yeah, that's the disturbing reality Pillsbury is trying to bring to light.
Yeah.
And he doesn't stop there. He goes on to explore how China's propaganda and influence operations have grown increasingly sophisticated in recent decades.
Right.
They've invested heavily in shaping global perceptions, often portraying the U.S. as a threat and China as a victim.
So it's not just about hard power.
Right.
It's about soft power as well.
Exactly.
It's about controlling the narrative, influencing perceptions, and subtly shaping how the world views China and its role in global affairs.
Yes.
Is that what Pillsbury means by the marathon? This constant multi-pronged effort to shift the global balance of power in their favor.
Exactly. And he argues that this marathon has entered a critical phase.
Okay.
Chapters 11 and 12 focus on what he calls the end game.
Yeah.
He believes China is becoming more assertive as they sense the finish line approaching.
But if they're already acting more assertively,
right,
doesn't that make his core argument a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy?
That's a point some critics raise.
Okay.
But Pillsbury would likely counter that his warnings are meant to wake the U.S. up to the reality of the situation, not to create the very outcome he fears.
Okay, fair point. But let's get into the specifics of this end game.
Right.
What are some of the areas where China is becoming more assertive?
So Pillsbury outlines several areas of concern.
Okay.
One is their rapidly growing military capabilities. He points to the development of what he calls assassin's mace technologies.
Okay.
Highly specialized weapons designed to counter U.S. strength.
So not just matching U.S. military power like tit for tat,
right?
But finding ways to exploit specific vulnerabilities. Is that what he means by assassin's mace?
Exactly. And another area of concern he highlights is economic warfare.
Okay.
Things like intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, and the manipulation of global trade rules.
Right.
Essentially using economic leverage to undermine U.S. competitiveness.
And of course, we can't forget about their efforts to control information and narratives.
Yeah.
Pillsbury argues they're actively working to censor dissent domestically, while also promoting their own narrative internationally.
Yeah.
Often through seemingly benign channels, like cultural exchanges and academic partnerships.
Exactly.
So it's a pretty bleak picture he paints.
It can be, yeah.
Does he offer any solutions, any way for the U.S. to counter this strategy? Or are we just doomed to lose this marathon?
Pillsbury isn't all doom and gloom.
Okay.
In fact, he believes the U.S. can still win this race.
Okay.
But it requires a fundamental shift.
Okay.
In our thinking and approach to China.
So it's not just about getting tough on trade or ramping up military spending. Right. It's about a more fundamental shift in how we perceive and engage with China. Precisely.
Pillsbury argues that the U.S. Needs to abandon this idea of China as a developing country that needs our help. He thinks this paternalistic attitude has blinded us to their true ambitions.
We've been operating under the assumption that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization. Yeah. That by helping China grow, they'd eventually embrace democracy and individual freedoms. Right. But Pillsbury suggests that that's not the plan at all.
Right, and this is where things get controversial.
Okay.
Pillsbury advocates for a more confrontational approach to China.
Okay.
He suggests things like limiting technology transfer, restricting China's access to sensitive information, and using tariffs and other economic measures to counter their unfair trade practices.
So essentially playing hardball.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that risk pushing them further down an adversarial path?
Right.
Like confirming their suspicions about the U.S.
Yeah.
Isn't that a dangerous game to play?
It's a valid concern, and in fact, some critics argue that Pillsbury's recommendations could actually be counterproductive, leading to a spiral of escalation and making cooperation on global issues like climate change and nuclear proliferation even more difficult.
So it's a delicate balance.
It is.
We need to recognize the reality of their ambitions without necessarily provoking a conflict.
Right.
But isn't there a risk that Pillsbury might be overstating the threat?
Mm-hmm.
Could he be cherry picking evidence to fit his narrative?
That's another criticism that's been leveled at the book. Some argue that Pillsbury overemphasizes the influence of the being paid, the hawks, while downplaying the role of reformers and moderates within the Chinese government.
And isn't there also an argument to be made that focusing solely on China's strategic intentions ignores the very real internal challenges they face? Things like income inequality, environmental degradation, an aging population.
Absolutely.
These could all potentially derail their ambitions, regardless of their long-term strategy. Right?
Absolutely. And that's an important point to keep in mind. China is not a monolithic entity.
Right.
There are competing factions, internal struggles, and a whole host of domestic factors that could influence their trajectory.
So while the 100-year marathon presents a compelling and frankly unsettling case, it's not the whole story. We need to consider these nuances and complexities as we try to understand China's rise and its implications for the world.
That's exactly right. And that's why it's so important to engage with diverse perspectives on this issue, to read beyond the headlines, to question our assumptions, and to be open to the possibility that the future might not unfold exactly as we expect it to.
Well said. And at the end of the day, whether you agree with Pillsbury's conclusions or not, the 100-year marathon is a book that forces you to think critically about the U.S.-China relationship and the challenges we face in the 21st century.
For sure.
It's a wake-up call, urging us to be more strategic, more discerning, and more proactive in shaping the future we want to see.
It challenges us to look beyond short-term gains and to consider the long-term implications of our actions, both for ourselves and for future generations.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, as you go about your day? Consider this. If China continues on this path, how will it impact your life, your work, your community, and what role do you want to play in shaping this unfolding narrative?
It's a big question.
Because this isn't just a story about two countries. It's a story about the future of our world.
Absolutely.
And we all have a stake in how it unfolds.